Thank you very much, Chief Justice Burke. The story of the fixing of the 1919 World Series of Baseball between the Chicago White Sox and the Cincinnati Reds, commonly referred to as the Black Sox scandal, may be one of the most widely known events in American sports. It inspired two operas, is referenced in literature from The Great Gatsby to The Natural, and figures in plots of films as familiar as The Godfather Part II and Field of Dreams. But at the same time, the Black Sox scandal is obscured by a fog of legend, confusion, and misunderstanding. Our presentation tonight makes no claim to be the definitive or complete telling of this tale. We are indebted to Mr. William Lamb and his colleagues at the Society for American Baseball Research for their writings and public presentations on this case, including Lamb's book, Black Sox in the Courtroom, and Saber's book, Scandal on the South Side, the 1919 Chicago White Sox. For the sake of time and clarity, some characters have been combined as composites, and the events have been selected, edited, and compressed with an emphasis on the judicial proceedings, grand jury, criminal trial, and subsequent civil litigation. Some historical documents, including court filings, no longer exist, because over the last century, they were destroyed, lost, or possibly stolen. Where actual court transcripts exist, or comments from interviews and news articles have been found, we have tried our best to use them. However, in other instances, as Mr. Lamb has done, we make reasonable assumptions as to what was said or occurred, or have drawn reasonable inferences from existing facts. In 1919 and years immediately before and after, many significant events occurred, nationally and worldwide, that feel all too familiar today. The game of baseball has not and does not operate in a vacuum. Accordingly, some of these events are referenced in the play, the following panel presentation, and in our booklet. We encourage you to consider the context that these elements provide. The history of race relations in the United States and its effect on the social fabric of our country is obviously complex, and a detailed discussion of this subject is beyond the scope of today's play, but it is discussed in the panel presentation and the booklet. From April to November 1919, the period before and after the World Series, at least 25 major race riots occurred between whites and blacks in some 15 states across the United States in what became known as the Red Summer. In late July and through early August, the city of Chicago experienced significant racial violence. It began when a white man threw stones at Eugene Williams, a black teenager, who had unintentionally floated into an unofficially segregated portion of the 29th Street beach. This led to the drowning death of the young man. White police officers did not arrest the assailant, but instead they arrested several African Americans on complaints from whites. 5 days of attacks by whites and retaliation by blacks, and then back and forth between the groups across the South Side, resulted in 38 fatalities, 23 blacks and 15 whites. At least 537 people were seriously wounded, 26 police officers were hurt, 2,000 dwellings were damaged, and unknown millions of dollars were expended. Additionally, social interactions were upended as the great influenza pandemic threatened the world during 1918 to 1919, killing an estimated 50 million people worldwide and approximately 675,000 in the US. Another great change loomed in the summer of 1919 after the ratification in January of the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. During the summer of 1919, individuals and gambling syndicates were putting together plans for speakeasies that would sustain the flow of alcohol and broaden the access to gambling. The history of gambling in sports is embedded in the Black Sox story, and the impact of gambling on sports in our time will be included in the panel presentation this evening. Although women in Illinois had won limited access to the ballot box in 1913, gaining a voice in the selection of presidential electors and some state offices, it took until August 1920 and the ratification of another constitutional amendment, the 19th, to allow women, white women, full voting rights across the country. However, women in Illinois were not allowed to sit on state court juries until 1939, and thus none of them sat on the Black Sox criminal case jury. Significantly, from a historical standpoint, in the Black Sox grand juries and criminal trial, all of the judges, attorneys, and jurors were men, white men. Seated in the front row of the audience tonight are two sets of jurors, one reflecting the composition of the 1921 criminal case, and another reflecting the likely composition of a contemporary jury pool. Another key aspect of the historical backdrop is that in 1917, America became deeply engaged in the war to end all wars, now known as World War I. Because the war continued through the following year, the 1918 regular baseball season was shortened, with many ball players serving in the military. Reportedly, White Sox owner Charles Comiskey called players heroes if they served in the military, or slackers if they opted for jobs in civilian defense industries that often allowed them to play baseball in stateside company leagues. After the war ended in 1918, the 1919 regular season game schedule was restored, and the World Series schedule expanded, as many Americans were ready to leave their troubles behind with trips to the ballpark for hot dogs, Cracker Jack, and the great American pastime. With this background information, let's
play ball!
Of course, all of the players in the 1919 World Series were white. Another 38 years would pass before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball in 1947 by becoming the first African-American ball player and future Hall of Famer, a subject of our panel presentation. Robinson led the way for Chicago's future Hall of Famers, Minnie Minoso, who became the first Latin and Black player for the White Sox in 1951, and Ernie Banks, who became the first Black player for the Cubs in 1953. But for now, we are back in the fall of 1919.
Still, it really doesn't matter.
After all, who wins the flag?
Good, clean sport is what we're after.
And we aim to make our brag
To each near or distant nation.
Whereon shines the sporting sun.
But of all our games gymnastic, baseball is the cleanest one.
Throw the World Series, Eddie? But we're a cinch to beat the Reds.
And where's your share from winning it in 1917? Chicks got guys, Swede, who are offering enough. You could put some money away.
By most accounts, shortstop Swede Risberg was one of the first players that knuckleballing pitcher Eddie Seacott and first baseman Chick Gandil approached about the plan.
Gambling's illegal, Eddie.
And nobody does it. That's why they print the odds in the newspaper.
Cheating.
The cheating's as old as baseball.
If we get caught,
Who's going to catch us? The umps? You think they aren't lining their pockets on some of those calls?
but the series?
Nothing happened to the Cubs in last year's series. I hear they got offered 10 grand.
I don't think they got offered.
Nobody wants to catch anybody fixing a game. That just proves the games are being fixed. 10,000 they offered the Cubs. I would not do anything like that for less.
Eddie, who's got that kind of money?
Chick knows somebody.
Seacott may have been referring to retired pitcher Sleepy Bill Burns.
You never nodded off at a ball game?
Not in the dugout.
Well, I spent the summer of 1919 traveling the circuit and offering players around the league the opportunity to purchase oil leases in San Saba County, Texas.
Where oil was not discovered until 1982.
I started talking about a more immediate plan with my old pal, Billy Mahog.
Though I only played 2 games in the major leagues, in my time as a boxer, I met a number of gentlemen with the assets to influence the outcome of a match. I approached Arnold Rothstein, who I had known to pay generously for useful information.
I was not in on it.
would not have gone into it under any circumstances, and did not bet a cent on the series after I found out what was underway.
That's a direct quote.
Billy, don't bother, Mr. Rothstein. Let me introduce you to my friend, Abe Patel.
Patel? Aren't you Rothstein's bagman?
Arnold Rothstein is a friend of mine.
And who's this?
Oh, this is my friend, Bennett.
He's actually David Zelser, a gambler from Des Moines.
Mr. Rothstein suggested we speak with you in more detail.
Meanwhile, Eddie Seacott is getting nervous that the money isn't coming through and arranges a meeting with two men identified as Sullivan and Brown.
Joseph Sport Sullivan from Boston, my associate, Brown.
Actually, Nat Evans, a junior partner in several gambling casino ventures, to Arnold Rothstein.
Well, if you can assure me you have all the players in agreement, I know someone willing to bankroll the endeavor.
I was not in on it, would not have gone into it under any circumstances, and did not bet a cent on the series after I found out what was underway.
Rothstein lost at least $6,000 betting on the World Series.
Joe, you let a couple balls get past you in left field. You swing at a couple of bad pitches. That's all you got to do to get your share.
I'd rather get a World Series share.
You think Joe Jackson is going to get a fair slice of that? Old Roman Comiskey called you a slacker last season because you went to help the war effort, busting your neck in the shipyard. He just about pinned a medal on Cocky Collins out on second base when he joined the Marines and got a lot of fresh air doing drills and basic training. Closest he got to Europe was a postcard.
Eddie.
Pal, you may not know how to read so good, but you got a head on your shoulders. Collins is always bragging about that Ivy League Columbia University degree he got, but he hasn't had to learn what you got. You got to look out for yourself because nobody else will.
Playing on the resentment of Collins' favored treatment, pitcher Eddie Seacott and first baseman Chick Gandil cemented the commitment of left fielder Joe Jackson. Along with center fielder Happy Felch, pitcher Lefty Williams, third baseman Buck Weaver, shortstop Swede Risberg, and utility infielder Fred McMullen, to their plan to profit from losing the World Series.
Mr. Moran, Hugh Fullerton, Chicago Herald-Examiner. How are you going to manage your Cincinnati Reds to adjust to the expansion to a best 5 out of 9 game series this year?
Well, frankly, with the depth of our pitching staff, I think it gives us an advantage. I've got a lot of great arms. With the influenza making Red Faber too ill to pitch for the Sox, we won't just be playing to win the series. We'll be playing to win by the biggest score possible.
I admire your optimism, Bet.
Kid Gleason, tell us about your White Sox.
I manage the best team in the world. Oh, with Eddie Seacott and Lefty Williams, I have the two greatest pitchers in the game today. Your best arm had 3 wins in his entire career before last season. I like our odds.
Okay. Readers, looking ahead to Game 1 of this series, odds makers are aware of the inequity between these teams and strongly favor Gleason's White Sox. Pitcher Eddie Seacott, a veteran of Chicago's 1917 championship team, will continue his 29-game winning season, starting on the mound against Cincinnati's left-hander Dutch Ruther, who built a successful season this year, adding 19 wins to his previous 3 in his major league career.
Hugh, I hope you didn't put any of your own money on the Sox.
On the afternoon before the opening game, Fullerton ran into Seacott's connection, Sleepy Bill Burns, in the hotel telegraph room.
Smart money's moving to Cincinnati. Word to the wise, the Reds are already in.
After confirming that bookmakers were now favoring Cincinnati, Fullerton wired an addendum to the paper the next day.
Advise all not to bet on series. Ugly rumors afloat.
Game 1! Wednesday, October 1st. Redland Field, Cincinnati, Ohio.
All right.
Scoreless in the top half of the first inning, Kid Gleason's White Sox now take the field behind their ace, Eddie Seacott.
His first pitch to the Cincinnati leadoff man is a fastball over the plate for a strike.
Seacott has incredible control of the ball. He's only hit 2 batsmen over 307 innings.
Well, Seacott delivers the next pitch. Oh, square into Rath's back. This may not be Seacott's day.
With that pitch, Eddie just signed his contract, Hugh. I'm gonna go see if anybody will take my action.
It's now a 1-1 tie on the bottom of the fourth inning. With one out and a runner on first, the Reds' Larry Koff is at the plate.
He hits a soft comebacker to Seacott.
Looks like a double play opportunity.
Seacott hesitates as the lead base runner heads towards second. Seacott finally throws the shortstop Swede Risberg.
But Risberg stumbles over the base and his throw is too late to beat the runner at first.
That is not the White Sox we've seen all season. Instead of a double play at the end of the inning, Seacott will face Greasy Neal with 2 on.
Single by Neal.
Another hit by the Reds puts them ahead 2-1.
The pitcher Dutch Ruther has a chance to help his own cause. And he does with a triple off the left center field fence, bringing in 2 more runs for the Reds.
Another single. And another puts the Reds in front 6-1.
And it looks like that's all for Seacott today, as Kid Gleason motions for reliever Roy Wilkson to take the ball to try to keep the Sox in this game.
Seacott doesn't last 4 innings. Maybe his arm is worn out from those 300 innings he pitched in the regular season.
Chicago Tribune says, Sox lose an opener 9-1.
My boys outclass the White Sox in every department of play. Tomorrow they're going to go out there and make it 2 in a row.
He just suffered from a little overconfidence today. If we hadn't missed that double play, it'd all be a different story. I feel just the same now as I did this morning. Confident we'll take the series.
Sleepy. Bill, wait up.
Eddie gotta run.
We pulled it off, didn't we? The guys are meeting at the hotel to split up the 20 grand for this game.
Mr. Attell wasn't convinced.
Sleepy, I've never pitched that bad.
Attell wants to see how your things go tomorrow. Then I'll see what I can bring you. Remember what you found under your pillow? He's good for it.
Game 2!
Thursday, October 2nd, Redland Field, Cincinnati, Ohio.
It's been a pitching battle between 23-game winner control pitcher Lefty Williams and the Reds' Slim Salee. Into the bottom of the fourth, both have held their opponents scoreless.
Kid Gleason had been getting the performance he wanted from Lefty, but Williams has walked the first 2 batters he faced this inning.
Gleason needs Lefty to get back on his game.
But there's a single for the Reds, bringing in a base runner for a 1-0 Reds lead.
Then another walk by Williams. And the pitch.
And a Reds triple! Cincinnati finishes the fourth with a 3-0 lead.
With more walks from the normally reliable Williams and bad base running when the Sox manage to hit, Chicago is never able to make the game competitive.
Chicago Tribune says, White Sox crushed again 4-2.
You know, Claude Williams was a great help to us today with those 6 bases on balls. Hey, well, we thank him.
Readers, with the uncharacteristically wild pitching of Lefty Williams, Gleason's squad faces the toughest proposition a ball club ever went up against, trying to come back from 2 games behind.
I hope you're in a hurry because you got 40,000 in your jacket.
I got 10.
You're not double-crossing us, are you?
Mr. Attell is not convinced he's getting anything. He thought it just looked like Lefty had a bad day.
We got to make it look like we're playing to win.
Take the 10. Tell your guys 1 more game to convince him. Attell's good for it.
When we kick this one, he better be.
The teams, the press, and the gamblers took the overnight train from Cincinnati to Chicago.
Game 3!
Friday, October 3rd, Comiskey Park, Chicago, Illinois.
Revived by playing before their hometown fans, the Sox came back to life behind the pitching of left-hander Dickie Kerr.
Chicago Tribune, Kerr hurls Sox to victory 3-0.
Oh, Kerr pitched one of the prettiest games I've ever looked at. Now, once we get even with these Reds, this series is as good as over.
Eddie Seacott, wait a minute.
Oh, you got something for us?
I'm busted, Eddie. I put my whole stake on this game because you promised.
If you can get Attell to come through on your end, maybe I can pitch you back into it tomorrow.
Game 4!
Saturday, October 4th, Comiskey Park, Chicago, Illinois.
Readers, In this afternoon's game, Eddie Seacott displayed a double personality. He pitched splendidly, allowing just 5 hits over 9 innings. But in his fielding miscues, he was his own worst enemy. In the top of the 5th inning, he muffed an easy comebacker hit by the Reds' Pat Duncan. But with time to make the play at first, he threw wildly, allowing Duncan to advance to second. When the next batter drilled a single to left, Joe Jackson held Duncan at third with a bullet toward home plate. But Seacott inexplicably attempted to cut the throw off, deflecting the ball into foul territory for his second error in the inning and allowing Duncan to trot home, scoring the only run the Reds would need to defeat the scoreless Southsiders.
Chicago Tribune says, Sox humbled in 4th game, 2-0.
Now, so far this series it's been all about luck. And we haven't had any.
Game 5!
Monday, October 6th, Comiskey Park, Chicago, Illinois.
For the White Sox, Lefty Williams was back for his second start after his disappointing loss on Game 2.
With the 5th game, Pat Moran started his 5th starting pitcher of the series, former White Sox player Hod Eller, who punished his former teammates, striking out 9 batters and allowing only 3 hits.
Unfortunately for the Sox, Williams echoed his previous appearance by pitching well, except for one disastrous inning. In the 6th, the Sox gave up 4 runs on Williams' shaky pitching and a throwing error. And then, that outrageous fielding misplay by center fielder Happy Felsch.
The White Sox bats were no help in overcoming the deficit, having been held scoreless for 22 innings.
Chicago Tribune, Sox crumble before Ella, 5-0.
I don't know what's the matter, but I do know something is wrong with my gang. The bunch I had fighting in August for the pennant, they would have trimmed this Cincinnati bunch without a struggle. The bunch I have now, they couldn't beat a high school team.
We only need one more game now. Doesn't make any difference whether it comes tomorrow, the next day, or the next. We are sure winners.
Game 6!
Tuesday, October 7th. After another overnight train ride, the series returns to Redland Field, Cincinnati, Ohio.
This is going to be the most exciting game. Gleason places Chicago's hopes on Dickie Kerr, the only Sox pitcher who had managed to post a win in the series. Moran calls on Dutch Ruther, winner of Game 1, to start on the mound for the Reds.
But in the 3rd and 4th innings, Kerr allows a series of hits, and the Sox trail the Reds 4-0.
Kerr didn't look like the same pitcher he'd been in Game 3.
Ruther was pitching strongly, mowing down Sox batters in the first 4 innings. But in the 5th, Ruther weakens, allowing 2 walks. Then an infield hit by Kerr, and a sacrifice fly by Eddie Collins, bringing in a snap to the White Sox 26-inning scoreless streak.
Yes! In the 6th, the Sox staged their first rally in the series with consecutive hits by Buck Weaver, Joe Jackson, and Happy Felsch.
In the 10th inning, their timely hitting continued, with Chick Gandil driving in the Sox winning run.
Chicago Tribune, Sox fight to victory in 10th, 5-4.
Now it comes down to Eddie Seacott's pitching in Game 7. If we can take that one, the next 2 will be easy.
Game 7!
Wednesday, October 8th, Redland Field, Cincinnati, Ohio. Chicago Tribune, Sox battle to 3rd victory!
Readers, today's game was the matchup astute observers of the game had expected. The Reds were no match, as Joe Jackson and Happy Felsch each provided 2 RBIs in their best performance of the series. The Sox pitching ace Eddie Seacott was back in form, allowing only 7 hits and a single harmless run, while pitching a complete game.
We're on our way now. Now, Lefty Williams is a wonderful pitcher, ready to bring his best stuff for Game 8 tomorrow. We're hitting so good, I could go in there and pitch myself and beat the Reds.
You were so good out there, Eddie. It looked like you were trying to win.
That's what Mr. Comiskey pays me to do.
You better get your squad back in line, Seacott. The people who invested in you want to get their money's worth.
Game 8!
Thursday, October 9th. After another train trip, the series resumes in Comiskey Park, Chicago, Illinois.
Kid Gleason's faith in his wonderful pitcher looks well placed, as Lefty Williams gets a pop fly out from the first Reds batter.
But then the Reds single to right.
And another.
Then a double down the right field line, scoring the lead runner. That's another Reds double, giving them a 3-0 advantage.
Kid Gleason takes the ball from Lefty Williams, who only pitched a third of an inning and leaves the Sox in a deep hole.
In the third inning, Joe Jackson gives the hometown fans some hope with the only home run for either team in the series.
In the bottom of the ninth, with the Sox trailing 10-5, the fans looked again to Jackson for hope as he stepped up to the plate with 2 outs and runners at second and third. But instead of a game-changing slam, Jackson grounded to second base and was thrown out at first to end the game and the series.
Chicago Tribune, Reds are new world champions!
I tell you, those Reds, they had no business beating a team like the White Sox. We played the worst baseball that we had played all year. Something was wrong.
And then he said one more thing.
I didn't like the betting odds. I wish no one had ever bet $1 on the team.
And with that, the series was over. But not the story. After the World Series finished, the Sox received a tip from St. Louis that its players were involved in a fix. So Charles Comiskey directed Kid Gleason and a group of White Sox representatives to travel there to investigate. Gleason met with Harry Redman, owner of the Majestic Theater in East St. Louis, who told Gleason about the actions of Carl Zork, Sport Sullivan, and Ben Franklin that convinced him the series was fixed. Gleason went back to Chicago to meet with Chicago Sox owner Charles Comiskey, who hired a detective agency to investigate.
In December, Hugh Fullerton wrote in the New York Evening World,
The charge has been made that 7 members of the Chicago White Sox team entered into a conspiracy with certain gamblers to throw the series. I have steadfastly refused to believe this possible, yet the story is told openly with so much circumstantial evidence and with so many names, places, and dates that one is bewildered. Some of the club owners are for a thorough and open investigation into the charges and the most drastic punishment of anyone found guilty. Others are for keeping silent and allowing it to blow over. Comiskey is an honest man, a baseball man, who is known for his sportsmanship and squareness. It can be stated that he will throw some men off his club the moment he is assured that some of the teams owned by his enemies will not pick them up and use them against him. The time has come for straight talk. How can club owners expect writers, editors, and fans to have any faith in them or their game if they make no effort to clean up the scandal?
Sour grapes because you picked the losing team? Decent baseball writers wouldn't dignify these fix rumors. That puts a lot of honest ball players under suspicion. It's a shame, Hugh.
As the 1920 season approached, the report from Charles Comiskey's detectives came back inconclusive. With no mechanism to prevent other owners from hiring the players under suspicion, Comiskey offered Eddie Seacott a contract for $10,000, doubling his base salary from 1919. He offered Happy Felsch a contract for $7,000, a raise of more than $3,000. Lefty Williams signed a contract for $6,000, nearly doubling his salary. Joe Jackson accepted a 3-year contract that raised his salary from $6,000 to $8,000 a year.
However, Comiskey offered Chick Gandil a contract that included no raise. Gandil refused to sign. Comiskey placed him on the ineligible list for the season, ending Gandil's major league career.
With the core of the team intact, the 1920 Sox were in a 3-way pennant race with New York and Cleveland, as attendance at major league ballparks exploded in a post-war boom, and the excitement of the beginning of the live ball era, with Babe Ruth hitting an unheard of 54 home runs.
But before the close of the season, the next threat to the White Sox future wasn't on the field or in the speakeasies, but on the north side of Chicago, in the office of William Wrigley, the owner of the Chicago Cubs.
The crooks and the gamblers in baseball must go. Baseball is the greatest American sport, and it must not be made less attractive to the public by the presence of dishonest ball players in their ranks.
Mr. Wrigley had become incensed about the impact of gambling because he was convinced that the Los Angeles Angels, a minor league team that he owned, had been cheated out of the Pacific Coast League Championship by game fixing.
The grand jury in that case focused on the bribery of players on the Salt Lake City baseball team by the players of the Vernon, California Tigers to allow the Tigers to win a series of games and claim the league title in their race against Wrigley's Angels. The grand jury returned indictments charging 3 players and 1 gambler of first, conspiracy to defraud the runner-up Cubs farm team, the Los Angeles Angels, of bonus money for winning the pennant. Second, conspiracy to defraud the owners of the Vernon, Salt Lake City, and Los Angeles teams of their right to have games honestly and fairly decided. And finally, conspiracy to defraud paying ticket holders of the fixed games. However, Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Frank R. Willis dismissed the indictments.
The conduct alleged, while reprehensible, was not criminal in nature. There is nothing in the Penal Code of California providing for prosecution of players and gamblers working together to affect the outcome of a sporting event. The conspiracy, if it existed and if it was carried out, constituted a violation of the players' contract with their employer that the men should play to the best of their ability. The remedy for that is civil courts.
As the judge's ruling precluded criminal penalties, the president of the Pacific Coast League was quick to take another course.
These players stand indicted and convicted in the eyes of the Coast League baseball public. If the law cannot punish them, it remains for baseball to do its share anyway, and at least keep them from participating in the professional ranks. They shall all be expelled from organized baseball.
In 1921, anti-sports corruption legislation became effective in California, and Illinois followed suit with such legislation, effective July 1st, 1922, after the Black Sox events.
In August of 1920, before this legislation was passed, the president of the Chicago Cubs, William Veeck Sr., was informed of allegations of an attempt to fix a game between the Cubs and the Philadelphia Phillies. Knowing he might face the wrath of Mr. Wrigley if he ignored this information, Veeck made public statements that he had taken actions to interrupt this fix attempt. Hearing Veeck's statements, newly installed Chief Judge of the Cook County Criminal Courts, Charles A. McDonald, addressed a recently impaneled grand jury.
Press accounts of the recent baseball scandal involving a coterie of unscrupulous gamblers' efforts to fix the outcome of a game between the Chicago Cubs and the Philadelphia Phillies threaten the integrity of our national sport. That healthful, wholesome exercise for our country's youth. It is the duty of this grand jury to investigate thoroughly so that everyone involved in the conspiracy to bring the national game of baseball into disrepute should be brought to speedy justice and exposed to public scorn.
We will discuss the legal ethics of Judge McDonald's comments to the grand jury with our panelists later. Grand juries date back to 12th century in England and are the primary way in which those who are accused of a serious crime in this country are brought to trial. Grand juries have several important and unique properties. Usually, they are composed of 16 to 23 grand jurors who consider evidence brought against one or more individuals or entities. A majority vote of the grand jury determines whether the continued prosecution of an accused is warranted, with an affirmative vote known as a true bill. A grand jury operates according to statutes, court rules, and local practices in the locale where the offense occurred, but the universal principle is secrecy. There is no public or press attendance. The only persons aware of the specific process are the grand jurors, the stenographer, the grand jury clerical personnel, the prosecutor, and the witness. All of them, except for any witness, are bound by an oath to keep the proceedings secret. It's an essential element to allow witnesses to testify freely without fear of disclosure, to prevent jury and witness tampering, and to protect the innocent who may be accused but not indicted. The Illinois Constitution in 1920 and still today includes two important provisions for grand jury proceedings. No person shall be held to answer for a criminal offense unless on indictment of a grand jury, and no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to give evidence against himself. The grand jury proceedings began in late September 1920. You will see many examples tonight of how the initial proceedings were replete with potential ethical violations or violations of the law, including leaking grand jury testimony to the press.
While the August 1920 Cubs-Phillies game had been the starting point for the grand jury, the focus of the investigation quickly turned to the 1919 World Series, with Sox owner Charles Comiskey appearing before the grand jury, accompanied by his son and Harry Grabiner, the team's secretary. An irregular occurrence because neither accompanying guest was a lawyer.
At all times, I have endeavored to be honest and fair with the public, fair with my ball players, and in turn, my reward has been the confidence the people have shown in my integrity and honesty. I did receive a number of reports that raised my suspicions about some of my players, to the point that I withheld series checks for 8 players. To resolve these concerns, I offered a reward of $10,000 for information on the alleged fix and retained private detectives to conduct an investigation. Neither of those efforts resulted in any information to substantiate the rumors.
However, other grand jury testimony did substantiate these rumors, and in violation of the principle of secrecy, was leaked to the press on a regular basis. For example, sports writer James Crusenberry identified first baseman Chick Gandil as a leader of the fix, along with Arnold Rothstein and Abe Attell as gamblers financing the payoffs. At the end of the day, Assistant State's Attorney Hartley Replogle addressed a gathering of reporters.
The last World Series between the Chicago White Sox and the Cincinnati Reds was not on the square. Between 5 to 7 players on the White Sox are involved.
Judge McDonald, grand jury foreman Henry Brigham issued a public statement.
We have evidence that crooked work has been done, but we believe it has been confined to comparatively few players and was a result of the pollution of the players by an unscrupulous gang of professional gamblers.
Proof of baseball bribery found. Chicago Daily News.
Grand jury finds convincing evidence. Los Angeles Times.
Hal Chase and Abe Attell behind $100,000 fix. Chicago Tribune.
The impartiality of the court and state's attorney's office was suspect, and the secrecy of the grand jury proceedings compromised. But it was an interview in the Philadelphia North American with former boxer, ball player, and current gambler Billy Maharg that would propel the case forward.
It was my friend Bill Burns. Sleepy Burns, right? He brung me into it. Eddie Seacott and Chick Gandil cooked it all up. They came to Burns when the Sox were playing in New York at the end of the season. Told him there were 8 players ready to dump the series for $100,000. Arnold Rothstein, he didn't think it was possible, so he wouldn't touch it. But then Abe Attell came in, told everybody he was Rothstein's agent, because nobody would have believed that he had the $100,000, which he didn't. They throw game 1. He stiffs them the $20,000 they would do. They lose game 2. He only pays them half of what he promised. Game 3, those Sox play to win. Burns and I, we lost every cent we had on our clothes. I headed home to Philly. Then I hear that Attell's got backing from some folks in Des Moines and St. Louis ready to get the players back in. They get to Lefty Williams. He just crumbles in game 3. The whole upshot of the matter was that Attell and his gang cleaned up a fortune, and the Sox players were double-crossed out of 90,000 for fixing those games.
Within 48 hours, 4 White Sox players would admit their roles in the fix. After meeting with Assistant State's Attorney Rep Logel and the Sox General Counsel, Alfred Austrian, and without the presence of their own legal counsel, Eddie Seacott, Joe Jackson, and Claude Williams testified separately before the grand jury.
What is your name?
Eddie Seacott.
Joe Jackson.
Claude Williams.
Mr. Seacott, when were you first aware of a plan to fix the World Series?
It was first discussed at a meeting in the Ansonia Hotel in New York around September 10th or 12th.
Who was present at this meeting?
Well, there was Lefty Williams, Joe Jackson, Chick Gandil, Buck Weaver, Swede Risberg, Fred McMullen, and me. It was Gandil and McMullen who explained their plan.
It was first brought up to me in New York. Gandil called me to one side out in front of the Ansonia Hotel and put this thing to me.
I was not at the meeting at the Ansonia Hotel. But Chick Gandil promised me $20,000, but only paid me $5,000.
I told Gandil and McMullen I would not do anything like that for less than $10,000. They replied, we can get that together.
After the meeting at the Warner Hotel in Chicago, Gandil told me the fix was on whether I was in or not. I might as well get what I could.
I told Gandil there was so much double-crossing stuff. If I went in on the fix, I wanted the money put in my hand. When I got back to my hotel room that night, there was $10,000 under my pillow.
I was not at the Chicago Hotel meeting. I was told about it.
In game 1, I tried to walk the leadoff batter, but I hit him. From there on, I wanted to win, but I guess I tried too hard. The Reds just made clean base hits.
I didn't do anything intentional to lose game 2. I was a little nervous, naturally, and there was that triple by their shortstop.
A lot of people have been talking about how the third game, our first win, was square. Let me tell you something. The 8 of us did our best to kick it, but little Dickie Kerr won it by his pitching. Because he won it, the gamblers double-crossed us because they thought we double-crossed them.
In game 4, I was very anxious to get the ball, but we didn't make any runs. If we could have made 4 or 5 runs, I could have won that game. I didn't care if I was going to get shot out there. I wanted to win that game and the series.
The fourth confession came from Happy Felsch in an interview published in the Chicago Evening American.
Well, the beans are all spilled, and I think that I am through with baseball. And I never did anything towards throwing a game. That fly ball, I just lost it in the sun. But don't make it appear that I'm trying to alibi. Seacott's story is true in every detail. He got his $10,000 because he was wise enough to stand pat for it. The rest of us roundheads just took their word for the proposition that we were going to get an even split on the $100,000.
The grand jury returned indictments charging 5 counts of conspiracy to obtain money by false pretenses via a confidence game for 8 White Sox players: Eddie Seacott, Chick Gandil, Swede Risberg, Joe Jackson, Oscar Felch, Claude Williams, Buck Weaver, and Fred McMullen, along with gamblers Bill Burns, Hal Chase, Abe Attell, Sport Sullivan, and Rachel Brown for their role in the fix. Gandil, Risberg, McMullen, and Weaver, however, did not join their teammates in confessing, but adamantly argued their innocence and their intention to fight the charges. But that was just the beginning of the complications in bringing the case to trial. In November of 1920, on the coattails of Republican Warren G. Harding's election as president, Republican Judge Robert Crowe was elected state's attorney, and he found the case in disarray, with missing evidence and transcripts. Chicago Federal District Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis was appointed to the newly created position of Commissioner of Major League Baseball in hopes that he could lead the sports through this crisis. Still a sitting federal judge, he threatened to initiate a federal probe if any of the grand jury records had been tampered with or were missing. Deepening the prosecution's troubles, some of the players were now disputing their own confessions that were important elements of the prosecution's case.
I hear that interview with me was given on a phone call. Well, it wasn't me on the other end of the line.
I never confessed to throwing a ball game in my life, and I never will.
While the new prosecution team was hoping for a delay to give them time to rebuild their case, then trial judge William Devers set a quick trial date. State's Attorney Crow's team was besieged with a variety of defense motions, including an effort to exclude the player's grand jury testimony. And he was embarrassed by a wire service story quoting an unknown assistant's memorandum.
These indictments are a lemon. If the case goes to trial, the result is inevitable. It will be rejected.
State's Attorney Crow dismissed the charges with a nolle pros, or dismissal without prejudice motion, on March 17, 1921, and convened a second regular grand jury on March 18th. On March 26th, after hearing from just 5 witnesses and the reading of minutes and transcripts from the previous grand jury, new grand jury returned superseding indictments, expanding on the original charges, re-indicting the original defendants, and adding 5 more gamblers to the roster of defendants. Getting the defendants to trial, though, was the prosecution's next problem. Many of the defendants were out of state and needed to be extradited. Extradition is a federal constitutional requirement by which a court obtains jurisdiction over a defendant, which is the court's legal authority over a party.
Efforts to extradite Hal Chase from California failed because the prosecution did not submit the proper extradition paperwork. And so Chase successfully escaped prosecution.
After reports that Boston's Sport Sullivan was hiding in Montreal, the Cook County prosecutors made efforts to pressure the Canadian government to expel him. The Boston police, however, were surprised that no one sought their assistance, as they reported seeing Sullivan almost daily in Beantown. He remained at large.
The state's attorney's office obtained a warrant for Rachel Brown's arrest, though it was unexecuted as they did not know who he was, believing the name was an alias for someone they had not otherwise identified.
In New York, gambler Abe Battel's attorney successfully argued that his client was innocent and being confused with a second Abe Battel, who allegedly had impersonated him.
St. Louis gambler Ben Franklin, no relation to the founding father, pled inflammatory rheumatism. He was excused from the trial when his attorney offered a physician's affidavit claiming he needed 3 weeks to recover from an arthritic attack.
Sox infielder Fred McMullen claimed he was in hard luck financially and Illinois would have to pay his way from California for him to stand trial. Well, his requests were ignored. And he arrived in Chicago after the proceeding had begun and was never tried.
The state's attorney's office used a different strategy to bring Sleepy Bill Burns to Chicago from Del Rio, Texas. With financial assistance from the American League, the office dispatched unindicted gambler Billy Maharg to induce Burns to return with him to Chicago.
Oh, come on. At the defense table, the defendants who appeared were represented by an assortment of a dozen of the finest criminal defense attorneys from across the Midwest, represented here as a composite.
The prosecution was represented by a team of experienced trial lawyers from the state's attorney's office, supported behind the scenes by a group of attorneys employed by the American League, also represented tonight by a single actor.
On the judge's bench was judicial novice Hugo Morris Friend, presiding over his first significant case. With Chicago's temperatures in the 90s during a summer heat wave, shirt sleeves were the accepted attire for most participants in the trial.
On July 16, 1921, 12 primarily working-class white men were impaneled with hydraulic press operator William Barry as the foreman.
Before the prosecution began to lay out their case, they made one important announcement.
Your Honor, the state's attorney's office has granted William Burns immunity from prosecution, and he will testify for the prosecution. Upon completion of his truthful testimony, we will dismiss all charges against him.
Well, that put everyone on the edge of their seats. For 2 days, they've listened to boring testimony from Comiskey about the seating capacity of the ballpark, and Kid Gleason about reading the World Series rules to the players. Well, everyone awaited my arrival to get the show started. Judge?
Mr. Burns, are you also known as Sleepy Bill Burns?
Yes, but I'm wide awake now.
And are you aware of a conspiracy to fix the outcome of the 1919 World Series?
Would you ask me here if I wasn't?
Do you know the origin
It
of
started with seeking the backing of Arnold Rothstein, who said he wasn't interested. And then, through Hal Chase, going to Abe Attell. I don't see Rothstein or Attell in the courtroom today. I worked it with my friend Billy Mahog. Hi there, Billy. Meeting with Attell and his guy Bennett, who I guess is known as Zelsa in this room. In the middle of September, I met with Eddie Seacott and Chick Gandil at the Ansonia Hotel. And then 2 days before the start of the series, I had a sit down at the Sinton Hotel in Cincinnati with Eddie, Chick, Swede Risberg. Those three did all the talking, and Lefty Williams, Happy Felsch, Buck Weaver, and Fred McMullen. They had big eyes and wanted $100,000 up front, but I explained that my folks would meet that number, but needed some assurance of the fix, so they'd pay the money $20,000 after each loss. Well, the Sox were fine with that, and Eddie and Lefty agreed they'd pitch to lose games 1 and 2. Well, everything was hunky-dory until Attell decided to chisel them out of the money. Billy Mahog will tell you that.
After game 1, Chick Gandil started calling double cross when we showed up at the hotel without the cash. Sleepy and I calmed him down, telling him we'll bring 2 payments after the next go. So after they blow the second game, Sleepy and I headed to the Sinton Hotel to pick up the $40,000. Attell, he stiffs the players again, gives us just $10,000 to pay him.
I was not happy about the position I was in, but I went to Chick's room. Seacott was with him, and Risberg and McMullen and 2 other players I do not specifically recall. On account of being on edge, I tossed the 10 on the bed, and Gandil starts in again about being double-crossed. And I can't blame him, but we go for a walk, and he calms down, and when we say goodnight, he gives me his assurance they will lose game 3.
So Sleepy and I, we figure we better take care of ourselves before this whole thing goes south, and we each put our entire stake on Cincinnati. Then Dickie Kerr pitches that game 3 shutout, and we are toast. I said forget it, and went home to Philly.
I'm busted. But now, Abe Attell comes up telling me it was Rothstein's orders not to pay, and now Attell is offering $40,000 out of his own pocket if I can get the Sox to put the fix back on. Well, I'm hoping to get back on my feet with a cut of the deal, so I take it to Gandil, who's smart enough to turn it down. However, I later hear from Chase that Attell and Zelsa told him that Rothstein's now changed his mind and would finance the fix. So the deal gets back on.
In cross-examination, the defense attempted to undermine the testimony of Burns and Mahorg with hostile questions, which backfired.
You don't like me much, do you, Bill?
Sure I do. You're one smart fella. I wish we'd had you at the head of this fix. We'd all be rich now.
Based on Burns' testimony, Judge Friend ruled that the prosecution had presented sufficient evidence of the existence of a conspiracy that would allow more expansive testimony to be introduced, including testimony that predated the allegations in the indictments. Under 1919 Illinois law, a conspiracy was complete upon the mere agreement to commit an unlawful act. Unlike Illinois conspiracy law in effect today, no overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy was required. The existing law should have provided the prosecution with an advantage because it did not have to prove that the players threw a game, only that they had entered into an agreement to do so. But a more difficult burden was to show that the object of the conspiracy was an unlawful act. Illinois did not have a law criminalizing the corruption of sporting events until July 1st, 1922, nearly 3 years after the World Series. Thus, the prosecutors had to argue that the fix was a form of criminal fraud, such as obtaining money under false pretenses. It was on a similar matter that the Pacific Coast League case had failed. Judge Friend also ruled that the prosecution elicited sufficient evidence of a conspiracy to defraud through the testimony of Burns, such that under Illinois conspiracy law, every co-conspirator is vicariously liable for the acts of each co-conspirator in the furtherance of the conspiracy.
The prosecution calls Harry Redmond. Mr. Redmond, what is your profession?
I own the Majestic Theater in East St. Louis, one of the finest picture palaces in the state.
And you are a gambler.
Not professionally, sir.
But it was through those connections that you became aware of a conspiracy to fix the World Series.
Ben Franklin told me that there were 8 Sox players ready to toss it, but they backed out because they hadn't been paid.
And what was Mr. Franklin's interest in the affair?
Well, he was trying to raise the money to get the fix back on. He wanted me to put $5,000 into his fund.
And did you do so?
I am a gambler, sir, not a cheat.
And what do you know about Carl Zork's participation in this enterprise?
Just what he told me. He comes up to me in the Morrison Hotel in Chicago after the Sox had won it, after the Sox had lost it, nearly grinning from ear to ear, dancing from excitement, saying, "I'm the little red-headed fellow from St. Louis who's responsible for it all."
Mr. Redmond, you came to Chicago to speak to some of the White Sox executives after the World Series, didn't you?
To help with their investigation?
But the club's attorney said you were a blackmailer.
To my face, he didn't.
But you were seeking payment from the league, or was it just the team?
Do you want to step outside and repeat that?
Gentlemen, that's enough. We have some business to attend to before this trial can proceed.
The business that Judge Friend referred to was an evidentiary hearing to determine whether and to what extent the grand jury testimony of Seacott, Jackson, and Williams could be used by the prosecution.
These statements were induced by promises of immunity from the prosecution.
Yet the defense offers no evidence of these promises. And the accused signed waivers of their legal rights when they began their testimony before the grand jury.
Produce those waivers.
Your Honor, we are all aware that those waivers, along with the transcripts of their testimony, were apparently stolen by someone attempting to interfere with the state's case, or to capitalize on the notoriety of this case in order to profit from the theft. But our court stenographers have recreated the testimony in the same way that they prepared the original transcripts from the notes in shorthand they took at that trial. The defense has not questioned their accuracy. As to the waivers, I am prepared to offer testimony from all 23 members of the grand jury that they witnessed the signing of these waivers in the courtroom.
My clients will testify that they had put their trust in oral promises made to them by the White Sox attorney, State's Attorney Rep Logel, and Judge McDonald.
I went downtown to see Mr. Austrian, the Sox lawyer. He told me Eddie Seacott had fingered me and I would be indicted in the next 20 minutes.
Austrian promised me I wouldn't be punished if I cooperated.
He read me a letter saying I'd been suspended by the White Sox. Of course, I couldn't read the letter myself and said I wanted my own lawyer.
Mr. Austrian told me I didn't need a lawyer.
He said I wouldn't be punished if I confessed.
Austrian and the state's attorney assured me that the promise I would not get punished was still good.
Going into the courtroom, the state's attorney said no sentence, no fine, long as I confessed. So I signed the paper they put in front of me.
They asked me to sign a waiver, but I would have signed my own death warrant if they wanted me to. Judge McDonald told me my only punishment would be banishment from organized baseball.
Interpreting my conversation with these men as an offer of immunity from prosecution is a complete distortion. I did have some sympathy for Mr. Williams. Since he was a follower rather than a leader of the conspiracy, I told him that his cooperation would likely be viewed favorably in sentencing. But Seacott and Jackson, they freely told me the details that implicated themselves and the other defendants in the case.
After reviewing these players' statements before the grand jury and hearing the testimony of the state's attorney, Judge McDonald, and others about the waivers of their rights that they each signed, I believe that this testimony was voluntarily rendered and is thus admissible in court.
Your Honor.
However, based on the Confrontation Clause of the Illinois Constitution, names of any defendants who did not testify in court or at the grand jury must be redacted from the grand jury testimony of Seacott, Jackson, and Williams. Please proceed with the reading of the transcripts.
The state's attorney, Rep. Logel, asked, Mr. Seacott, who was present at the Ansonia Hotel meeting when you were first aware of a plan to fix the World Series?
Well, there was Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, and me. It was Mr. Blank and Mr. Blank who explained their plan.
I was not at the meeting at the Ansonia Hotel. But Mr. Blank promised me $20,000, but only gave me $5,000.
After coming back to Chicago, I was called down to the Warner Hotel, where Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, Mr. Blank, and Mr. Blank were.
Judge Friend, can the jury have a break? A little fresh air might make this easier to follow.
As the prosecution sensed that the momentum they felt they had built was dissipating, they scrambled to shorten their case and bring it to a hurried end. Once they closed, the defense presented a flurry of motions.
We move to strike the testimony of Harry Redmond.
Denied.
We move that all charges be dismissed because the prosecution obtained the superseding indictments from the second grand jury through the use of the transcripts of the testimony to the first grand jury.
Denied.
Well, we move to dismiss the charges against defendants Ben Levy, Lou Levy, Carl Zork, Buck Weaver, and Happy Felsch.
Your Honor, we raise no objection to the dismissal of charges against Ben and Lou Levy.
Defendant's motion granted as to the levies. And the others?
Oh, we stand by those charges.
There is so little evidence against these men that I doubt I would allow a guilty verdict to stand if it were brought in. But as some evidence has been brought against them, I will not dismiss their charges.
After the rulings on the defense motions, the defense began its case in chief. Not a single White Sox defendant testified on his own behalf. Rather, the defense attorneys sought to poke holes in the prosecution's case. For accused gamblers David Zeltzer and Carl Zork, the defense presented witnesses who provided alibis for their whereabouts when the prosecution's witnesses had placed them in meetings with the ball players. Zork's counsel called a series of almost 20 character witnesses, all claiming that he was a model citizen.
Swede Risberg's counsel introduced medical evidence that he had a cold during the World Series, and the medicine given had led to his poor performance.
Chick Gandal's attorney attacked the charges from a different angle, questioning whether the players' actions had harmed the White Sox organization.
Harry Grabiner, what is your occupation?
I am the club secretary for Mr. Comiskey's White Sox.
So you have some knowledge of the team's revenues for each season.
Yes, that is a part of my position with the club.
And what were the gross revenues for the White Sox for the 1919 season?
There were $521,175.76.
And for the 1920 season, the season after these alleged heinous crimes that supposedly damaged the value of Mr. Comiskey's investment in the team?
The total for that season was $910,306.53.
So the revenues for the team the year after the World Series increased by $390,000. Is that right?
Yes, that sounds right.
Well, if my math is correct, that's about a 43% increase for Mr. Comiskey's benefit.
Well, I haven't done that calculation.
Well, take my word for it. So as the state has made no case against the defendants, we see no reason to place the players on the witness stand. The defense rests, Your Honor.
Caught off guard by the quick close of the defense case, the prosecution scrambled to organize its rebuttal.
Without testimony from the accused, there was little for the prosecutors to rebut.
Your Honor, the prosecution would call Harry Rutlinger of the Chicago Evening American to the stand.
For what purpose?
To provide the context for the confession Happy Felsch made to him when interviewed for that paper.
But Mr. Felsch did not testify. No evidence or testimony was presented by Mr. Felsch for you to rebut. I deny your request.
It is, but we have just learned of this public confession.
That statement was published some 11 months ago. The negligence in the state's attorney's office should not jeopardize a defendant's liberty. You should have brought this in testimony during your case in chief. It is not rebuttal evidence. Let's proceed to your closing arguments.
Gentlemen of the jury, as you prepare to consider your verdict in this case, you must consider what these players did in conspiring to take bribes to lose the World Series of 1919 is not only a crime against the White Sox, not only theft of money from trusting fans of the sport, but as an assault. These men are killers. They conspired to kill baseball, to murder our greatest sport, to defraud the public and their colleagues, even to defraud the children of this country. Your children, my children, who pay their bleacher admission fee to watch their heroes play a game they believe to be honest.
Jurors, don't let the emotional arguments of the prosecution blind you to the fundamental unfairness of these charges. The state of Illinois has only recently enacted a sports corruption statute. There was no such law in force when these men played in the World Series of 1919. And to convict them under this recently enacted bill would be improper, unfair, and outside the bounds of the law.
You have detailed testimony from the individuals these players took dirty money from to lose the series. That clearly proves their guilt.
The prosecution's case is based on the testimony of gamblers who have attempted to turn circumstances to their favor in this scandal. Their words cannot be trusted.
You have the word of the players themselves. You have heard confessions from Eddie Seacott, Joe Jackson, and Claude Williams. But just because Joe Jackson and Claude Williams have admitted their guilt, they deserve no special treatment, and you must go to the limit in punishing them. Chick Gandil may have been the ringleader, but Eddie Seacott may be the worst of this bunch, having demanded his traitorous payoff in advance of his co-conspirators. He not only betrayed his partners in crime, but had the audacity to hobnob with his innocent teammates to allay the suspicions of the men he had betrayed.
Why are the major wagerers, the ones who had the wealth to finance this fix, not sitting at the defense table with these humble ball players? Why has the state allowed them to escape charges that, if true, would dwarf what these men are accused of? Why are these underpaid ball players and these penny anti-gamblers from St. Louis and Des Moines brought here to be the scapegoats in this case? Ask the wealthy powers of baseball. Ask those who want you to convict these few men in order to make this series fix seem but an aberrant event, so that they can continue to conceal the endemic scope of gambling in major baseball leagues.
A murderer deserves the utmost in punishment. Eddie Seacott, Joe Jackson, Happy Felsch, Buck Weaver, Charles Risberg, Claude Williams, Chick Gandil, and these gamblers conspired to murder baseball. And I demand that you 12 gentlemen of the jury inflict the maximum penalty of a $2,000 fine and 5 years in the penitentiary on each one of them. The fans of our national sport demand justice for the offense committed against them. They came to see a ball game, but all they got was a con game.
Have baseball fans lost their faith in these athletes to play with integrity? These are not fallen idols. Find them not guilty and send them back to Comiskey Park and listen to the thunderous applause that will come from the grandstand.
Gentlemen of the jury, the evidence and arguments in this case have been completed, and I now will instruct you as to the law. The defendants are charged with the offense of conspiracy to defraud. The state has the burden of proving the guilt of each defendant beyond a reasonable doubt, and this burden remains on the state throughout the case. A defendant is not required to prove his innocence. Your agreement on a verdict must be unanimous. As you convene in your jury room, please remember that faithful performance by you of your duties as jurors is vital to the administration of justice.
The jury deliberated for only 2 hours and 47 minutes. After the casting of a single ballot, Foreman Barry informed the bailiffs that a verdict had been reached.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Joe Jackson, not guilty. We, the jury, find the defendant, Eddie Seacott, not guilty.
Oh, I knew you were on the square.
Defendants not guilty of all charges.
Hail, hail, the gang's all here. What the deuce do we care? What the deuce do we care? Hail, hail, we're full of cheer. What the deuce do we care now?
I got a statement for the evening paper.
Well, the verdict was a complete vindication of the most mistreated ball players in history.
And you, sir, something for the Herald Examiner.
We did our best.
Well, what did you think of the judge's
Good
instructions?
day. I did my talking to the jury.
I hear the newspaper writers thought you convinced us with that Burns fellow. He didn't make a favorable impression on us.
I'm sorry to hear that.
And all that Mr. Blank business couldn't make heads or tails. But you know that fellow from the White Sox, the one who kept their accounts? I'd be giving those players bonuses instead of firing him if they brought me business like that. Maybe the next time we see Eddie Seacott, he'll be out on the diamond putting strikes over the plate!
The state's attorney's office dropped the charges against infielder Fred McMullen, who had arrived late and never stood trial. Many observers asserted that the verdicts were the result of jury nullification, the knowing and deliberate rejection of evidence or refusal to apply the law, either because the jury wants to send a message or because the result indicated by the evidence is contrary to the jury's sense of justice or fairness. Throughout the trial, the Black Sox lawyers cultivated the players' similarity to the working-class men of the jury as the underappreciated laborers for a rich and unfeeling employer whose business thrived through their labor. But any hope of the players to return to the field were dashed the day after the verdict, when the Commissioner of Baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, issued this edict.
Regardless of the verdicts of juries,
No player that throws a ball game. No player that undertakes or promises to throw a ball game. No player that sits in conference with a bunch of crooked ball players and gamblers where the ways and means of throwing games are planned and discussed and does not promptly tell his club about it will ever play professional baseball. Just keep in mind, regardless of the verdicts of juries, baseball is entirely competent to protect itself against crooks, both inside and outside the game.
And none of the Black Sox players would ever appear in another major league game, only outlaw baseball with local teams. But in the aftermath of their banishment, Buck Weaver, Happy Felch, Swede Risberg, and Joe Jackson instituted civil litigation against the White Sox, pursuing grievances grounded in breach of contract, defamation, and restraint on their professional livelihoods. Buck Weaver pursued reinstatement to the league, filing multiple petitions to the Commissioner of Baseball, the first within a year of Landis's edict, and the final effort 30 years later in 1953. None of his petitions received a response. Outside of Milwaukee, where the Felch, Risberg, and Jackson suits were filed, only Jackson's breach of contract suit went to trial. It was founded on the 3-year contract Jackson had signed with the White Sox in February of 1920, after the World Series, but before the grand jury began its work. The club voided the pact when it released Jackson in March of 1921. In a pretrial deposition, Jackson swore to a set of fixed-related events at odds with his grand jury testimony.
I knew absolutely nothing about the throwing of the 1919 World Series until after it was over. Lefty Williams came into my room and he threw an envelope with $5,000 at my feet. He told me they had used my name negotiating with the gambler, saying I was in on it.
When confronted with his grand jury testimony at the trial during cross-examination, Jackson maintained more than 100 times that he had never made the statements recorded in the transcript of his grand jury testimony. The outraged judge cited Jackson for perjury and had him jailed overnight. When testifying on behalf of Jackson, Happy Felch denied his signature on club documents 16 times and was indicted and pled guilty to false swearing, a form of perjury. He was sentenced to 1-year probation.
Mr. Jackson, you stand here self-convicted and self-accused of perjury. Either your testimony here or your testimony before the Chicago grand jury was false. I think the false testimony was given here.
Shielded from the judge's actions, the jury returned a verdict in Jackson's favor, awarding him more than $16,000 for breach of contract damages. The jury based its judgment for Jackson on the legal principle of condonation. In their view, the White Sox executives knew of Jackson's involvement in the World Series fix before the 3-year contract was offered to him. In making that offer, they had effectively condoned his misconduct and therefore had no basis to void his contract when information about Jackson's involvement in the conspiracy became public. The judge received the jury's verdict with astonishment and indignation.
Jurors, you have failed to discharge your duties. Jackson stands before this court a convicted perjurer. I did not need a court or a jury to determine that. Jackson determined that for himself.
The White Sox attorneys filed a motion to set aside the verdict on the ground that it was based on a conspiracy to defeat justice and founded on perjury. Judge Friend signed the order and denied the judgment the jury had awarded. Thereafter, the players' civil lawsuits were settled for small amounts of money. Back in Chicago, Comiskey announced,
I will continue to fight crookedness in baseball, and if the sport cannot be kept clean, I will get out.
The legacy of Commissioner Landis's has remained inviolate for over a century. No player has been reinstated to the league after fixing games, and the current Major League Baseball contract bans all players from betting on games. The impact of the scandal on the future of baseball and other professional sports may have been corrective, but the scandal took a personal toll on the participants. Shortly before his death, Buck Weaver told an interviewer,
"A murderer serves his sentence and is let out. I got life."
I got 5,000. I could have gotten just about that much by being on the level if the Sox had won the series. And now, I'm out of baseball. The only profession I ever knew anything about. A lot of gamblers have gotten rich. The joke seems to be on us.
Mr. Jackson, who gave you the 5,000?
Lefty Williams came into my room and threw it down.
Where was Mrs. Jackson?
I think she was in her room. I'm pretty sure.
Does she know you got 5,000 for throwing those games?
She did that night, yes.
What did she say?
She said she thought it was an awful thing to do. Cried about it a while.
We're full of cheer. What the deuce do we care now?
For it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game. Casey was baseball mad, had the fever and had it bad. Just to root for the hometown crew, every Sue, Katie Blue. On a Saturday, her young beau called to see if she'd like to go to see a show, but Miss Kate said no. I'll tell you what you can do. Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack. I don't care if I never get back. Let me root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame. For it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old